talk about a little bit today when we're talking about, this crisis of refugees arriving at our border, and all these Honduran and Guatemalan and Salvadoran kids jumping the train, and the Mexicans jumping the train, and dealing with La Bestia, which is what they call the train, and being knocked off the top and grabbed by the gangs, and the femicide rates that are higher even than Juarez across the routes, and teenagers being dragged back to work with the different gangs. I mean, it's literally a Honduran teenager is safer living in Syria or Iraq than he is in Honduras, which has the highest murder rate in the world, and the same goes for a teenage girl. And what I've heard a lot of people say, when I go to different meetings and stuff, very well-intentioned administrative folks or people in immigration services or whatever, even in churches, right, is, we're glad to help these women with their babies and these kids and stuff. We're not inhuman, but it's hard for us to pick up the tab, and why don't they go back and fight for their own country and change it around, and we can give them some money for some projects so they learn to support themselves and stuff. And it frustrates me because it shows such a total lack of U.S. involvement history awareness. I mean, they've tried to do their own country. They've tried to get minimum wage rights. They've fought for social justice in a way that we can't even begin to imagine. We've never had to deal with what they've had to deal with. And the U.S. every time has stopped them. And I'm going to put my money where my mouth is on that and explain exactly why I say that. But the U.S. has played a phenomenal role in destroying their homelands, preventing the transition even into the 20th century, not to mention the 21st, destroyed the economy, put into power a network of ferociously crazed military people who are now the drug lords, many of whom in turn have worked or are still working for the CIA as paid informants, and therefore we can't take them out, we can't go after them, and no one else can either. So they're still living in terror of those very people that we put into power, armed and trained and funded, and now still protect. Of course they're running for their lives. I mean, we'd be gone if we were in that country, in those countries. So there's a whole lot of moral reasons why we, as American citizens, need to take people in, but also just legal and humanitarian ones. Many countries, Syria, Mexico, many countries with a far lower standard of living than the United States have taken in far more refugees per capita than the United States is dealing with at all, and we don't hear them complaining. You take in refugees because that's what we're supposed to do, morally, for one thing, but also legally. That's our international treaties. It's against the law to send someone back to Honduras or Mexico or whatever if they're in reasonable danger of being tortured or persecuted. So why do I have a case of a young woman who had just gotten protective orders against her Zeta boyfriend in Reynosa, and whose boyfriend left screaming, "If I ever catch you again, you're dead, bitch," and who had already tried to burn the trailer over her head with her and her children inside, and had battered her for years. But she was picked up one night just after dinner with her friends, not even very late. Her friends told the Border Patrol people that, take us, but let her go, she'll die, she won't survive the week if you send her back to Reynosa. Her boyfriend's over there, he's with the Zetas, he'll kill her, she has protective orders. They took her in, they processed all of them. She was crying and begging and pleading with them to let her go, saying that she wouldn't survive, and would they let her go get the protective orders so she could show them. And it was 2 in the morning, and the Border Patrol people said, "Look, lady, quit, just sign here on this voluntary departure thing. It's late at night, you sign." And she said, "I won't sign, it's una injusticia, I'll be dead within the week." And they, talked to her more and more and just said, "Sign here, this is it." And, what can you say? She's in detention, the guys have the guns. Yep. She signed under protest, the whole group was put back in the van and driven to the Reynosa Bridge. And she went across, and they found her incinerated in a car within the week. She told them. Her last words as she got out of the van were, "It's an injustice. When I die this week, it's on you." So talk about a violation of the Convention Against Torture and all of the other conventions on refugee status. But the really sad thing is this isn't all that's unusual. We're massively sending people back. There's a woman in detention that we're trying to assist right now who's a survivor of a massacre in Guatemala. 300 people were killed that day, including her entire family. She was 4. She's an eyewitness if they do another genocide trial, which is being planned. She's already been threatened for that. Her abusive husband keeps trying to kill her because she left him. And on top of that, the gangs want to kill her because she won't point out wealthy houses where she used to work as a maid. And the local immigration judge decided her risk of torture or persecution was too tenuous, too speculative. And they've ordered her deported. It's on appeal. But have we lost our minds? I mean, we're in total violation of our treaties and our international commitments. We're acting illegally, massively. So what is the U.S. connection? Why do I say that beyond all of these international treaties and understandings and moral reasons, what else does the United States have that puts any kind of responsibility or liability on us? And I'm going to talk about Guatemala just because that's a very typical case, and that's the one I know about very well personally. I spent a decade or more down there. And I'm sort of a human bungee cord. I go in and right back out as quick as they can toss me out. But Guatemala is very much like the old South Africa. The majority are the Mayan Indians. They're starving. The average man in the countryside comes up to my shoulder from malnutrition. They have an 80% illiteracy rate, 80% severe poverty rate, highest infant mortality and maternal mortality in the hemisphere, second only to Haiti.
Wow.
I mean, they're living as a serf population within their own country. Very, very abused, very severe racial discrimination against them at all times. And not surprisingly, there's been an indigenous uprising, a Mayan uprising, every generation for the last 500 years. They don't feel like being serfs. And they've kept their own languages, they wear their own clothing. There are still monuments up in the mountains they've never told the archaeologists about because they still go up there to worship. As one person told me, over there in the church, the priest's a good guy, he's a friend. That woman, in the robes up front, in Spanish, she's the Virgin Mary, and in Cachiquel, she's the corn goddess. So, they've got it worked out. They live together. They managed to coexist. But in 1954, there was the first reformist president ever out of that tiny landed gentry that was the descendants of the conquistadors that look kind of like me, right? I mean, that's a little teeny piece of the population. By the way, more than half of the Mayans can't vote. They're not registered. It really is like the old South Africa, the old Jim Crow situation here in the South. People often say, so why do they keep electing these guys as president? And it's like, they can't vote. Very simple. 80% of the country can't vote. But anyway, a reformist president did come in the 50s, tried very hard to do major reforms that would allow the campesino population to at least be able to eat, and did rural health programs, et cetera, and was buying back some of the biggest plantation land from the owners at the value they declared on the tax form. If more than a certain number of acres was lying fallow, unused, they'd buy back some of the fallow land. And the United Fruit Company had way undervalued their property in Guatemala. They were the biggest landowner in Guatemala in 1954. So they had way undervalued their holdings. They were basically cheating the Guatemalan government out of land taxes. So when it was bought back at the value they declared, they got very upset, went to Washington, D.C., screamed communism, and the CIA came straight down. It was the middle of the McCarthy era, armed a ragtag group of mercenaries, dissidents that basically were happy to work for us for some extra money, threw the president out. There was an enormous bloodbath, with the unionists that had just started, the literary movement, the health promoters. They were wiped out, peasant co-ops. They were just gone. And the president died heartbroken in exile. That government became one of the most bloodthirsty ever known, and later earned the title of not only genocide by the Truth Commission for the campaign of massacres that they led, but also the worst human rights violators in the Western Hemisphere back in the 80s. The number of disappeared in Guatemala, mostly Mayans, was 200,000, higher than Chile, Argentina, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Honduras combined. And even then, we don't really know how many people really died. There was no one to report to. The Red Cross wasn't allowed in. They just sort of closed the country down and marched across the Mayan highlands, village by village, wiping people out. A lot of people go, okay, so we put them in power. It's not our fault they turned out so bad. Well, actually, we kept funding that army while they carried out a 30-year campaign of genocide, including burning the Spanish embassy to the ground with all the Spanish embassy staff inside. All of them died, as did the 40 Mayan leaders who were peacefully occupying the building, asking for reforms and an end to the massacres. Everyone died. That was 81. We knew very well what was happening. We denied that for years, but then certain CIA files were released that show actually we had all these offices where we ran joint operating programs with the intelligence division in Guatemala where they were planning those massacres. And we just stood by and kept giving over the money. One document says, you know, they're going to massacre up at that village this week because they're really sure there's guerrillas up there. But, you know, I don't think there's any guerrillas up there. And they didn't warn anybody. They didn't tell anybody. They didn't tell these folks they had to stop. We were paying all the bills, but didn't tell them they had to stop. We were providing the airplanes. We were providing all the weaponry. We were providing the training up here at the School of the Americas. So the next one says, yeah, well, they went in there and killed everybody, but it was just peasants and old folks. You know, there was no guerrillas there. And that went on right up to the end of the war in the 90s. As the heat sort of came onto the Guatemalan military for being the pariah, insane army that it was, you know, Amnesty was hammering at them, Jimmy Carter was, the Inter-American Court, the UN, everybody was hammering them. And word was getting out about those massacres, even though they were able to pretty much snuff it out of the press anyway. But as it got worse and worse and worse, Congress started calling people under the carpet and saying, what the hell's going on? What are we doing backing this army? It's against the law for us to fund any military that's known to have systematic human rights violations. Which is why all the refugees were being turned back, saying, oh, you know, there's no real proof that that ever really happened. It might have been, you know, common criminals. It's because we couldn't give political asylum to millions of people, you know, fleeing the country and still give money to the army, which we were determined to do. Who were the guerrillas? Church leaders, Mayan Indian leadership people working for land reform, unionists, people in political parties, journalists. It's like basically this room full of people. I mean, anyone like us that was trying to do very basic, very moderate social reforms to like crawl into the 20th century, it was over for, you know, you could either die, go into exile, or hit the mountains. Many people went into exile, a whole lot of people died, and the rest of them, maybe they were pacifists, but they took up guns. There just weren't a lot of choices right then. So the CIA still would get in front of Congress, so would the United States Embassy staff, embassy after embassy after embassy, it didn't matter who the ambassador was, and say, no, 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 there's no proof who's doing these massacres, there's no evidence who's doing these disappearances, it's probably a lot of common crime. The guerrillas do at least half, probably more, you know, and all of us who were on the ground there knew that wasn't true. The guerrillas weren't going around killing anybody. I mean, they were in combat. It's not that they never killed, but they weren't going around yanking people off the streets and burning villages down. Everybody knew who was doing that. I mean, the guys came in uniform, right? And at the end of the war, when the United Nations finished with the Truth Commission report, they blasted the United States for knowingly aiding and abetting the Guatemalan Intelligence Division carry out 30 years of genocide. And they found that the Guatemalan military was in fact responsible not for 50%, but 95% of the war crimes that had happened, including the annihilation of more than 300 villages. So pretty bad tally. Throughout all of that period, what was the CIA and the embassy saying to Congress, which was getting very upset, and to the OAS and to the UN? My own husband, of course, had at this point disappeared. He was an indigenous leader and was being tortured. We knew that he'd been captured alive. And we were trying to find him, and the embassy had said over and over they had no information about him or any other secret prisoners being held by the army. Congress was trying to very badly to help me because there was a lot of evidence that he certainly was captured alive and certainly was being tortured. And at that point they kept saying, you know, if there are torture cells somewhere, we're just here to professionalize the army. We do give them money, we give them weapons, we give them training. We're trying to teach them how to do it right. We would never know about torture cells like that. After 3 years of denial, and after 3 hunger strikes that we won't even get into, those were kind of gruesome, and a 60 Minutes bulletin, a congressman came out who was on one of the intelligence committees and had been insisting on information for close to a year, Congressman Torricelli. And so legally the CIA had to answer him, but hadn't. And then someone gave him the file on my husband. And he held a press conference and said, yes, your husband is dead. He has been killed. He was captured alive, lightly but not seriously wounded. And he held up the CIA report saying that. And that they're going to keep him as a secret prisoner and fake his death so that they can better squeeze him for his intelligence, read that torture, without having the international community come after them for human rights violations. And that document went to the State Department from the CIA, and also from the CIA to the White House, not that third year, but 6 days after he was captured. So the lies went on for years while he was in fact still alive. He died around year 2.5. Also, they said they didn't know about anyone else. It says right in those files, and there's about 350 other prisoners of war in the same situation. They're being thrown out of helicopters, tossed down wells, burned in sugarcane fields, and just horrifying reports. 3 years of lies, we could have saved a lot of those people. But what it really was horrifying to read is that the cell of torturers who killed my husband were high-level intelligence officials because he'd been a commanding officer. So, he was like the goose that laid the golden egg in terms of intelligence. So they tortured him for 3 years with doctors standing by, shades of Guantanamo. But it was a highest group of intelligence officials within the Army. And that network, I think 12 of them had trained here in the United States at the School of the Americas, and they were paid informants of the CIA. And the CIA was bringing payments to them every time they tortured Everardo, trying to buy the information. So they knew they were paying for the results of torture, even though there was no ongoing security threat to the United States. We just wanted the information. We were on the other side. But no one was going after American citizens in Guatemala. Nothing like that had happened. There had been an ambassador killed a generation earlier, which at one point an embassy staff tried to say was my husband's fault, but he was 11 when that happened. The URNG didn't exist. It had been a generation before. So we were in the torture cells, we were paying the torturers, and we were doing joint planning sessions with him, and we were withholding all that information from police, from family, from courts, from lawyers, everybody that could have stopped him. When the war ended, a key goal was to hold Nuremberg, because so many people had been killed in such horrific ways. No one was ever just killed. The little bit I know about Everardo, I know that he was battered for more than a year. Guns into his mouth, hideous bruises. I know that he was strapped down to a gurney with an oxygen tank next to the bed and injected with something that made him swell so incredibly that one arm and leg ruptured and they had to bandage it. I know that he was considered too smart and led them into an ambush instead of up to the radio station after he'd been tortured severely, and they were very upset about the ambush, so they put him in a full body cast. He was in cement from neck to ankles. And then the most probable version of his death is that he was dismembered and scattered across a sugarcane field so that I couldn't identify him. They were very upset about my hunger strikes. That's just an average story for Guatemalan deaths. The idea was to be so terrifying that everybody would go home and never talk about minimum wage again, never talk about justice again. So the war ended, and we all hoped, the Army had to demobilize, there was supposed to be justice, there was supposed to be the possibility of war crimes trials, amnesty was prohibited under the law and also under the peace accords. We were all kind of hoping maybe it would be different. And the U.S. keeps backing former Army people. The current president of Guatemala is General Otto Perez Molina, who, yes, was up in the genocide area all through the war. He vehemently denied that during his campaign. He said he was never up in the Ichil Triangle. And the U.S. ambassador said there's no evidence he was in the genocide area. He was just a high-level officer, and he's a great reformist. Everybody ought to vote for him. And funded him and did all kinds of great stuff. So we finally found a video of him using a false name in heavy camouflage with a bush in his hat, standing over 3 dead bodies of very battered and very dead prisoners of war up in the Ichil Triangle. And when people talk to the villagers living around that military base, it's like, oh yeah, Tito, we know him, Tito Arias. He was here for years, he's bad news. So everybody knows who he is, but once again, the US government is backing them. Now, what really is terrifying and what really is the final link of all these kids and women and children coming up here is, first of all, we've devastated their country, right? And this isn't just Guatemala, it's all of the countries. It's like volcanic ruins. So, you know, throwing money at them isn't going to help. It's going to go straight to the army. 1954, when that bloodbath occurred, we poured more money into Guatemala than all of Latin America to prove that Guatemala could be a showcase of democracy. That's exactly the phrase we used in Iraq, by the way, and the two worked equally well. It's like pouring money into an incinerator, right? It doesn't go to the people. So the army did demobilize, according to the peace accords, but they formed a parallel structure. All they did was take off their uniforms. So this network of army people runs the de facto army. And they also cross-link with the government structure and totally control them. They've always controlled the police force. They do now. They own the police department. The courts, the Supreme Court justice that fought them for years and tried to get them convicted on genocide, he committed suicide this year because they kept going after his kids. He thought it was the only way left to protect them. The Attorney General has been run out of the country. The judge that sat on the genocide trial wore a bulletproof vest every day. Then they annulled the trial after she sentenced General Rios Montt to 80 years for genocide. She's been put off the case. They're trying to disbar her. 60 judges refused to hear the case on rehearing, and now one came in and they've already snarled all up on appeal and stuff. So there's no Nuremberg, and those people still own the country. Why aren't they being prosecuted? Why isn't the United States going in there like we did with Raul Noriega and dragging those people out of there and putting them in prison? I mean, we've got Raul Noriega up here. Remember when we went after, you know, in Panama, we invaded and surrounded the embassy and stuff and dragged him out? It's like, well, because some of the worst drug runners are in that parallel structure. They're high-level military drug lords. They're the drug lords. They just hire the gangs to do the dirty work of assassinations and stuff there at the bottom. They created the Zetas, who are like terrorizing our, you know, border area here. It's like that baby got a little bit too far out of control and now they fight each other. But they armed them and trained them. That was a military creation out of Guatemala, which in turn was out of the United States. One example is Colonel Alpérez, Julio Roberto Alpérez. He's the one that injected my husband with the toxic gas and who appears throughout the CIA documents and is noted to have also killed an American citizen earlier and also to have excelled at the liquidation campaign in the Highlands during the genocide era. Right after all the news broke about my husband's case, there was a big struggle between him and Otto Pérez Molina, the current president, both of them being CIA people, of course. They kept pointing the finger at each other. And Alpérez vanished into thin air. And we all wondered where he went. We thought Pérez Molina had killed him, right? I mean, the only explanation. And he turned out he was living with his whole family in secret near the CIA. He had a little quiet job. He lived there for 10 years. And when I tried to subpoena him to come forward with his testimony, the CIA gave him a warning, and he fled back to Guatemala before I could catch him. We protected him. Do we know if he's really running drugs? Yeah, he's on the DEA corrupt officer list. They just were never able to go and tag him. The Justice Department had to get permission from the CIA before they could open a file on him as a war criminal that they might want to bring a war crimes case against. Celerino Castillo did a book about that. He was a former DEA agent and wrote about there's all these people we can't touch because they work with the CIA, but they're way high up. How did the military get so high up in the drug business? Because the Colombian drug lords 2 decades ago needed landing space for gasoline and refueling and stuff like that. And Guatemalan Army is the only one with any airstrips. They're the only ones with any airplane, and it's like sounded like good money. So they started out just sort of assisting, and then got very good at that business. So now they run their entire drug world on their own, also trafficking of women, also money laundering, you name it. It's just an entire mafia structure, which in turn controls the Guatemalan government completely and terrorizes the population. So it's the same killers. When you look at the condition of the bodies that are being found after they're killed by the drug lords, It's just like it was in the 80s. You know, 2 women out of a massacre zone were found in a dump in the Capitol with their teeth torn out and their breasts cut off and their feet cut off. And it's like, oh, they must have been in the drug stuff, you know, nothing to do with the government. But that's how we used to find them. And, you know, just saying, you know, it's not dirty war now, it's just drug stuff, it's the same people that were put in power, trained, and armed by the United States, and they're still protected by us. So when some kid runs up to the border and I hear, you know, really, it's you know, it's just, you know, he didn't know how to make it on his own, he just wants money, he wants a free handout, it's like, not quite. Okay, I think I did my
I have a question for Jennifer.
Yeah.
Jennifer,
Yeah.
I wanted to know, would you attribute that your husband's death was a result of our national foreign policy back in the 80s, when my grandfather would mention to me that he really resented the fact that we gave away the Panama Canal during the Carter administration? And I'm just wondering if this is attributed to our foreign policy to Central America, and just allowing them to go ahead and overlook and just ignore the 300,000 deaths since the early 80s and so forth in Guatemala. I'm just wondering if this is a result of our national foreign policy about Central America and about leaving the situation over with them. This is preceding the Carter administration, because you made a remark that during the Jimmy Carter administration that
He was one of the first to shut down military aid to any armies with systemic violations.
really.
He tried. Unfortunately, as we found out in my husband's case, the CIA had all kinds of unmarked monies and they kept right on funneling it to their partnership. It wasn't a result of our foreign policy, sure. We put the army in power. That army got rid of the Arbenz government. They were with us at the Bay of Pigs. We wanted them to protect us, or to fight for us against the, you know, with the Contras, against the other government in Nicaragua. And as one ambassador said, they'll be with us if we need them in Panama. And they fought with us in Iraq. That's our little extension of our army. They do all the dirty work, all the bloody stuff, and we make sure they don't go to jail, but we don't get blamed. So I think, you know, not just my husband, but probably 500,000 people in Guatemala have our policy to thank.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I will be there on May the 2nd.
Awesome.
Yeah.
There is a correctional facility down in Delhi too.
Yeah, there's a state prison there. Yeah.
We shut the one in Nixon down, but they just moved them over to Gilley. It was one for unaccompanied minors, and we have a lawsuit going on for what was probably, you know, probably 20, 30 kids. We have 11 that are still with us, but they were all sexually and physically abused there because none of the feds supervised.
Bye, Jennifer.
Bye.